You ever think about how an idea, just, a simple thought can spread, almost like a virus,
Mm.
and how it can actually change everything, how we see the world, maybe not always for the better.
Yeah, it's a powerful concept. Ideas shaping reality.
Well, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really getting into some fascinating, maybe even a bit alarming stuff. Material that suggests our societies, especially in the West, are facing a new kind of battle.
Not a physical war, though, more like a war on reason itself.
Exactly. Fought with infectious ideas. It's a really striking framework.
It really is. We're talking about concepts that don't just get debated. They sort of infiltrate the mind, change how people think without them even realizing it sometimes. A battle for common sense, as the source puts it.
Okay, so our source for this deep dive is an excerpt from a pretty provocative book. It's titled The Parasitic Mind: How Infectious Ideas Are Killing Common Sense. And our mission today, for you listening, is to unpack the main arguments, some of the really surprising claims in these pages. We want to help you understand what this war on reason actually looks like, so according to the author, how he thinks it's being fought, and maybe most importantly, why it might matter to you personally. All right, let's dive into that central metaphor then. The author isn't just saying he disagrees with certain ideas. He's framing them as something, well, much more dangerous. What does he actually mean by the parasitic mind?
Well, he uses this really vivid, almost biological analogy, comparing destructive ideas to brain parasites or mind viruses.
Okay, like actual parasites?
Kind of. Think about real parasites in nature. There's that Gordian worm, right? It makes a cricket jump into water so the worm can reproduce. Or think about malaria, how a mosquito bite completely changes the host's body.
Okay, I see the parallel. So the idea hijacks the host.
Exactly. The author argues that certain ideas can, in his words, parasitize human minds, rendering them impervious to critical thinking. So the idea isn't just in your head, it's effectively controlling your thought processes.
Yeah, that's a pretty unsettling thought. It's not just disagreement, it's like the idea rewires your brain. And he actually gives this condition a name, doesn't he?
He does. He coins this term ostrich parasitic syndrome, or OPS for short.
OPS.
And he describes it as a dreadful attack on reason. Basically, once someone is infected, they start rejecting realities that should be obvious, like as clear as gravity, he says.
Wow, so they just deny basic facts.
According to this view, yes.
Yeah.
And they build this alternate reality, which he calls unicornia.
Unicornia, right. A fantasy land where facts don't matter as much as feelings or ideology.
Precisely. A place detached from objective reality.
So these aren't just bad thoughts, they're treated like contagious agents. How does he explain their spread? Is there more to the virus analogy?
Oh, yeah, definitely. He leans heavily on Richard Dawkins' idea of memes.
Not internet memes, though.
No, the original concept, like packets of information, cultural units that spread from brain to brain. And just like biological viruses, these memes have different levels of virulence, how fast they spread, and valence, meaning whether they're positive or negative in effect.
So OPS, this ostrich parasitic syndrome, is like a disease caused by these memes.
That's the argument. A mimetic disease, an infection of thought patterns that replicates and spreads through society.
And if we follow this epidemic model, the author points a finger at universities, calls them patient zero for a lot of these mind viruses.
That's a central part of his thesis. That's where he believes many of these harmful ideas originate and gain legitimacy.
And the ultimate danger, if these ideas aren't challenged. What's the endgame he warns about?
He calls it the death of the West by 1,000 cuts.
Oof. Sounds dire.
It is. It's not a sudden collapse, but the slow creeping erosion. He argues that sentiments against reason, against science, against liberalism propagated by these mind viruses are gradually chipping away at the foundations of Western societies.
And he ties specific movements into this.
Yes, the book tries to connect the dots between things like postmodernism, what he calls radical feminism, certain forms of multiculturalism as a political ideology, and identity politics. He sees them as interconnected forces driving this erosion. And he even suggests that the rise of political figures like Donald Trump is, in part, a reaction against this trend, against the perceived tide of political correctness.
It's always interesting to see how someone's personal background influences their work. The author's own life story seems really crucial to his perspective on this whole war against reason. What was his upbringing like?
Yeah, his viewpoint is definitely shaped by, well, a pretty harrowing childhood. He grew up during the Lebanese Civil War, born in Beirut in 1964, part of a Jewish community that was shrinking. He talks about hearing chants of death to Jews when he was just 5, and remembering the fear on people's faces during the Yom Kippur War in 73. Experiencing that kind of hatred firsthand, he says, it leaves a mark.
I can only imagine. That's incredibly intense for a child. And then he had this huge shift in environment.
A massive shift. His family emigrated to Montreal in 1975. He describes it as going from falling bombs to falling snow.
Quite the contrast.
Absolutely. And there's this anecdote, kind of funny, but also sad. In his new school, he barely knew any English. When asked where he was from, he just mimed holding a machine gun to explain Lebanon.
Wow. That says a lot.
It does. And he argues that this direct experience with sectarian violence, with tribalism, where your group identity was everything, gave him this deep disdain for identity politics. He sees echoes of that tribalism in some modern movements, so that early trauma fuels his fight against this perceived war on reason.
So that experience really cemented these two core ideals he talks about: freedom and truth. He says they weren't taught, but almost genetic for him. How did that play out in his life?
Well, the freedom ideal showed up early. He mentions feeling repulsed by religious dogma, the herd-like rituals in synagogue as a kid. He just wanted freedom.
Like on the soccer field, too.
Yeah, exactly. As a number 10 player, he wanted complete freedom of movement, hated rigid coaching styles. And that translates to his academic career. He rejects being stuck in one narrow field, the careerist shackles, as he calls it.
He wants to explore everything.
Right. He says he researches what I like, moving between consumer behavior, psychology, evolutionary theory, economics, tackling stuff he calls forbidden knowledge, things some academics might shy away from because they're controversial.
It sounds like he actively avoids the ivory tower mentality, taking his ideas beyond academic journals.
Oh, completely. He compares only publishing in peer-reviewed journals to a garage band. He'd rather be on platforms like Joe Rogan, which he likens to having #1 Billboard hits, reaching a huge audience directly.
A very different approach than traditional academia.
Very. He sees it as getting the ideas out there, bypassing the gatekeepers, similar perhaps to how someone like Trump used social media.
Okay, and the other ideal, truth. How does it drive him?
He describes it as almost a pathological commitment to honesty. Says he has a physical negative reaction to intellectual dishonesty and ideological dogma. He sees himself as fighting for reason when it's abandoned for ignorance or ideology.
He believes truth has to come before ego, essentially.
Yes, exactly. Before that desire to just be proven right, which he admits is a common human failing, he contrasts it with epistemic humility, being willing to say, I don't know.
And there was a family story that really highlighted this for him.
Yes, a really telling one. A family member insisted the ancient Greeks were Christians and anti-Semitic. When shown clear evidence they weren't, they apparently twisted it, saying something like, yes, I said they weren't Christians, you said they were, so I'm right. Just this absurd lie to avoid admitting error.
Wow. That perfectly illustrates that ego defense he talks about.
It does. And he connects that to his frustration with the Dunning-Kruger effect you see online, people being incredibly confident despite, well, not knowing much. For him, intellectual honesty is paramount. Even admitting his own limits to students, he thinks that builds trust.
It seems like such a paradox, doesn't it? Universities are supposed to be these places of rigorous thought, seeking truth. But the author identifies them as patient zero for these mind viruses.
Oh.
How does he explain that happening?
Well, he talks about his own experiences, like at Cornell. He says even while getting solid scientific training, he started encountering what he just calls nonsensical gibberish in other departments. And he really points the finger at postmodernism as a major source.
Postmodernism. And he gives a pretty specific, maybe even hard to believe example of this gibberish.
Oh, yeah, he does. He brings up this infamous 1991 paper by a scholar named Stephen Jay Gould. Important note, not the famous Harvard paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould.
Right, different Gould.
Yes. And the paper title is quite something. The self-manipulation of my pervasive, perceived vital energy through product use. An introspective praxis perspective.
Okay. What does that even mean?
Well, the author basically dismisses it as autoethnography, like a Dear Diary entry dressed up in pseudo-intellectual drivel. He quotes parts where the scholar discusses things like discovering sexual feelings through eating, or how watching an erotic film led to a culminating crescendo of energy.
As part of an academic paper.
Apparently so. And for the author of The Parasitic Mind, this just showcases a complete lack of academic seriousness and rigor in certain fields.
That's definitely jarring. So how does he connect this kind of work specifically to postmodernism?
He argues that this style of scholarship, which often comes out of postmodern thinking, fundamentally rejects the idea of objective truth. If everything is subjective, if reality is just a social construct, then postmodernism, in his view, becomes a vehicle for anti-science and science denialism. He even calls it biophobia, a fear or denial of biological realities originating right within the university system.
And if objective truth is off the table, and it's all about subjective experience, it sounds like the whole academic reward system might get turned on its head.
That's exactly his point. He argues that universities, instead of being purveyors of truth, have somehow become these ecosystems of intellectual garbage. Why? Because the reward mechanisms are upside down. Meaning the system starts rewarding conformity to certain ideologies instead of rewarding genuine critical thinking or intellectual courage.
Can you give some examples of these reversed values he talks about?
Sure. He observes things like a herd mindset gets rewarded, while truly innovative thinkers get chastised. Academics who just stay in their lane and don't make waves are praised, but those who speak out, especially against dominant narratives, get punished. He also notes that hyperspecialization is often valued over broad synthetic thinking that connects different fields. And maybe most controversially, he claims that adhering to leftist tenets of progressivism is rewarded, while things like meritocracy advancement based on ability are frowned upon. He even observes that people who strongly believe in equality of outcomes rather than just opportunity often end up in top university administration jobs.
That really does sound like it would create a climate of fear, where academics might just censor themselves to avoid trouble.
He argues it absolutely does. He talks about widespread academic cowardice, says he gets emails all the time from professors who agree with him privately, maybe even want to collaborate, but they're too afraid to associate with him publicly. They fear the backlash, what he calls ideological Stalinism.
Wow, Stalinism. Strong words.
Very strong. He mentions an anonymous physicist who wrote a rebuttal to some politically correct statement, but published it anonymously because they feared career damage, even though they considered themselves a liberal person. And the fact that a publication like the Journal of Controversial Ideas even exists a place for academics to publish under pseudonyms, he says that alone speaks volumes about the state of academic freedom.
It's pretty bleak if scholars feel they need anonymity just to explore certain ideas. And it's not just self-censorship, right? He talks about active suppression, too.
Yes, that's a key piece. Things like disinvitation speakers getting canceled. And this reframing of free speech itself, where sometimes expressing certain views is equated with violence or even Nazism.
He mentions a specific event being canceled.
Yeah, an event at Ryerson University that was literally about the stifling of free speech on campus got canceled because activists objected to the speakers. He also brings up statistics from FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education.
What did they find?
Between 2000 and 2014, they tracked almost 200 attempts to disinvite speakers from U.S. universities, with a success rate around 40%. And these attempts were apparently 3 times more likely to succeed if the speaker was seen as being on the political right.
And there are some well-known names who face this.
Oh, yeah. People like Charles Murray, Christina Hoff Sommers, Camille Paglia, even Nobel laureate James Watson. And he notes the situation isn't much better in Canadian universities, citing a report giving most of them failing grades on free speech. It really paints a picture of declining open discourse.
This whole discussion really brings up that classic philosophical problem, the paradox of tolerance.
Karl Popper's idea. Basically, if a society is endlessly tolerant, even of intolerant ideas or movements that aim to destroy tolerance itself.
Then the intolerant forces might eventually win out and destroy tolerance altogether.
Exactly. Unlimited tolerance, Popper argued, can paradoxically lead to the disappearance of tolerance. It becomes a society that's intolerant of anything it perceives as intolerant, which can end up stifling legitimate debate and diverse viewpoints. It's a real tightrope walk for an open society.
Okay, so if reason is being sidelined and truth is seen as relative, what happens when emotion takes over? The author really digs into this tension between thinking and feeling.
Right. He acknowledges we're both thinking and feeling creatures, obviously. But the danger, he argues, arises when we apply the wrong system to a given situation, using emotion when logic is needed, or vice versa. And he uses some pretty recent political events as examples of where he thinks emotion completely overrode rational thought.
Like the reaction to Donald Trump's election as a major one he discusses.
Exactly. He suggests that for many people, particularly on the progressive side, the reaction wasn't a rational assessment of policies, but this intense, almost physical disgust, a visceral aesthetic injury, he calls it. And this emotional hatred, he argues, led to what some called Trump derangement syndrome, where it became impossible to evaluate anything he did objectively. He contrasts this with a more rational voting strategy, like focusing on your single most important issue, the lexicographic rule. For many voters, he suggests, choosing Trump might have been a perfectly rational calculation based on policy priorities, completely separate from the emotional storm surrounding him.
And he sees a similar dynamic in the Brett Kavanaugh confirmation hearings.
Yes, very similar. He argues that was driven by political tribalism fueled by emotional indignation, which superseded logic. He points to the fundamental attribution error, people attributing Kavanaugh's visible anger during the testimony to his underlying personality, his intemperate temperament.
Instead of attributing it to the situation itself, facing what the author calls a grotesque injustice with the accusations.
Precisely. He connects it to his own online persona, saying his belligerent disposition online isn't who he is all the time, but a specific reaction to what he sees as intellectual dishonesty in that context. A fair assessment of Kavanaugh, he argues, would have considered the context of the accusations, but emotion-driven detractors just projected their own feelings onto him.
So this paints a picture of a culture where, as the author puts it, feelings trump truth. And this has real-world consequences, especially for academics and scientists.
That's the core argument, a climate where being part of the perpetually aggrieved pays off, or at least gets attention. And this, he claims, has led to numerous cases of researchers and academics being canceled, forced out, or silenced just for challenging dominant narratives, even if they had solid scientific evidence on their side.
Can you walk us through some of those examples? They seem pretty stark.
Sure. Take Lawrence Summers, former Harvard president. He essentially lost his job after merely discussing the possibility of innate sex differences playing a role in STEM fields, even though there's scientific debate and evidence around that. Steven Pinker defended him, saying basically, shouldn't everything be discussable in a university?
Right.
And this happened even amidst data suggesting women actually receive preferential hiring in many STEM areas, which contradicts a simple victim narrative.
And the James Damore case at Google, that got huge media coverage.
Right. Damore wrote an internal memo suggesting innate differences might partly explain gender gaps in tech interest. Google had asked for comments on diversity, but they fired him. The author argues Damore's points were actually well supported by the scientific literature, but the takeaway seemed to be, as the author puts it, if the truth hurts, it must be suppressed for the sake of diversity, inclusion, equity, even if it means ignoring evidence.
That's a chilling interpretation. What's another case that illustrates this upside-down system he describes?
There's Alessandro Strumia, a physicist at CERN. He presented data showing male physicists tended to have higher citation counts, a standard academic metric. This challenged a narrative about female victimization in physics.
And the reaction.
He was condemned, called a blasphemer. Activist groups like Particles for Justice accused him of questioning humanity itself, which the author calls a grotesquely dishonest tactic. It ties back to that climate of fear, remember the anonymous physicist, and the Journal for Pseudonymous Publishing. It all points to a real chilling effect, according to this perspective.
The list seems to go on and on. What about Tim Hunt, the Nobel laureate, and Lazar Greenfield, the surgeon?
Sir Tim Hunt, Nobel Prize winner, essentially got pushed out of University College London over a joke. A poorly received joke, perhaps, about having trouble with girls in labs, but still a joke. Even leading female scientists defended him.
Wow. And Greenfield.
Lazar Greenfield, a very respected surgeon, was forced to resign as editor of a major journal, Surgery News, just for an editorial that discussed scientific research linking sperm exposure and depression in women. The author's point here is stark. Science is based on evidence, not politics.
And even trivial things seem to cause outrage, like the scientist with the shirt.
Matt Taylor, yeah. The astrophysicist involved in the incredible Philae probe landing on a comet. A massive scientific achievement overshadowed because he wore a shirt with cartoon women on it during a live stream. He was forced into this tearful public apology. The flick has shifted entirely from the science to the shirt.
It feels like this is a direct attack on free speech itself, moving beyond universities into the wider digital world.
The author argues it absolutely is. He talks about online platforms suppressing speech by hitting people's wallets, YouTube demonetizing videos. For instance, he says about a third of his own clips get flagged, sometimes automatically.
Economic censorship,
Yeah.
essentially.
Right. And platforms like Patreon and PayPal banning individuals like Carl Benjamin for speech violations. That led figures like Jordan Peterson and Dave Rubin to leave Patreon in protest, which then impacted the income of other creators using the platform, including the author himself. It's a way to silence people without direct government censorship.
And that common phrase, I believe in free speech, but he sees that as a sign of the problem.
A very dangerous sign in his view, because the but usually means, but we shouldn't hurt people's feelings. He argues forcefully that free speech isn't primarily for protecting polite compliments. It's precisely meant to protect the most obnoxious, offensive, and disgusting speech.
Within limits, presumably.
Yes, he acknowledges the standard limits, inciting violence, defamation, yelling fire in a theater. But he argues those limits are being twisted and weaponized to shut down speech based on ideological disagreement. He's particularly critical of hate speech laws in Europe, citing cases against people like Geert Wilders for criticizing Islam, and similar efforts in Canada like Motion 103 against Islamophobia. His stance is clear. In a free society, you must have the right to criticize, mock, or even fear any ideology. He directly contrasts President Obama's statement about the future not belonging to those who slander Islam's prophet with his own view. The future must belong to those who can freely critique all prophets and ideas.
This leads directly into his point about a double standard and how different religions are treated when criticized.
Yes, he draws a very sharp contrast here. On one hand, criticism of Islam. He points to the deadly violence following the Danish Muhammad cartoons, over 200 deaths worldwide, the horrific Charlie Hebdo attack in Paris, the riots and deaths after the Innocence of Muslims film.
Extremely violent reactions.
Extremely. Then he contrasts that with criticism of Christianity. Things like Andres Serrano's artwork, Piss Christ, Larry David pretending to splash urine on a Jesus picture in Curb Your Enthusiasm, the hit musical, The Book of Mormon, which satirizes Mormonism relentlessly.
And the reaction to those.
Comparatively minimal. Maybe some protests, some condemnation, but nothing like the scale of violence seen in response to critiques of Islam. His conclusion from this is blunt. All religions are not equal in their capacity to mete out violence and genocidal hate. He sees a dangerous imbalance in how societies react.
Given this focus on challenging ideas, it makes sense that he uses satire quite a bit himself, like a tool almost.
Yes, he calls it a surgeon's scalpel for critiquing these idea pathogens. He really champions satire, quoting people like Wyndham Lewis and Thomas Jefferson on its importance for revealing truth and testing ideas. There's that quote from Peter Sloterdijk he uses: "Whatever cannot stand satire is false."
So if an idea crumbles under ridicule, maybe it wasn't that solid to begin with.
That's the implication. Satire is a test of an idea's strength and validity.
And he's had some pretty striking examples where his own satire was completely missed, highlighting how these mind viruses can impair judgment.
Oh, definitely. There's the time Richard Dawkins tweeted that Allahu Akbar sounded aggressive. The author sarcastically replied that it actually means we love all people, especially Jews, women, and gays.
Which is
Right.
obviously not true.
Obviously. But Newsweek initially reported it seriously, and media in Pakistan ran with it, condemning Dawkins based on the satire before realizing their mistake.
That's incredible.
And another one involved Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez comparing U.S. border facilities to concentration camps. The author tweeted sarcastically to Donald Trump Jr. that AOC faced much greater daily threats than Holocaust survivors ever did.
Clearly satire.
You'd think. But conservative commentator Charlie Kirk apparently took it seriously and cited it approvingly. The author uses this to show how lobotomized logic or just intense ideological bias can make people completely miss even outlandishly obvious satire. Hashtag IVF, identity politics, and the victimhood industrial complex.
Okay, we've covered mind viruses, the attack on reason, free speech issues. Now let's get into another huge piece of this parasitic mind argument: identity politics, and what the author really provocatively labels the victimhood industrial complex. He says it leads to a tyranny of the minority. What's he mean by that?
He argues that on university campuses, student activists, social justice warriors, or SJWs, as he terms them, might be small in number, but they wield disproportionate power. They rule via the tyranny of the minority, he claims, often with backing from supportive professors and administrators.
How do they achieve that influence?
Through concepts like safe spaces, trigger warnings, identifying microaggressions, and pushing for strict speech codes. These tools, he contends, empower those who are perpetually indignant and outraged, giving their complaints significant weight.
The idea of a safe space sounds positive, though, a place free from harm, but he argues it's actually harmful, maladaptive.
Yeah, that's his controversial take. He compares the intellectual sterility of these safe spaces to kids growing up in allergen-poor environments. You know, how lack of exposure to everyday germs and allergens can weaken the immune system.
Right. Kids need some exposure to build resistance.
Exactly. He argues that shielding students from challenging, uncomfortable, or even offensive ideas prevents them from developing intellectual resilience, critical thinking muscles, and emotional maturity. They don't learn how to engage with disagreement.
And he sees trigger warnings as part of that. Infantilizing.
Yes, particularly trigger warnings. He calls them infantilizing human resilience. He believes they actually hinder people's ability to process difficult material.
And he has strong personal feelings on this, given his background.
Very strong. He talks about his own trauma from the Lebanese Civil War, nightmares he still had years later. But he says he doesn't need trigger warnings to watch war movies or discuss difficult topics. He argues it's actually antithetical to a fundamental principle of exposure therapy, the psychological technique where you gradually confront fears to overcome them.
So avoiding triggers prevents healing, in that view.
That's the argument. He even proposes a universal trigger warning for his own courses, basically saying, life is triggering. This course assumes you're an adult capable of handling complex ideas. It's a direct challenge to that culture.
That's quite a statement. And these concepts, like harm or trauma, seem to expand over time.
Yeah.
Concept creep, he calls it.
Yes, he borrows that term, concept creep, from the psychologist Nick Haslam, the idea that definitions of harm, abuse, trauma, mental illness, etc. tend to broaden over time. And then he adds his own theory, the homeostasis of victimology.
Homeostasis of victimology, what's that?
It's the idea that people, or perhaps societies, have a drive to maintain a certain perceived level of victimhood. So if actual severe victimhood decreases, which is generally a good thing, the definitions of what constitutes victimhood might expand to capture more minor incidents, turning banal daily interactions into exciting data supporting faux victimhood, as he puts it, or even leading to outright hoaxes.
And he uses a pretty extreme term for this phenomenon, collective Munchausen.
Yeah, it's definitely provocative. Based on Munchausen syndrome, where people fake illness for attention, he defines collective Munchausen as a group dynamic of feigning or exaggerating victimhood for sympathy and social gain. And collective Munchausen by proxy is piggybacking on other groups' perceived victimhood.
He gives the Jussie Smollett case as an example.
As a prime example, yes. Orchestrating a fake hate crime, he argues, specifically to ascend the victimhood hierarchy and gain status or sympathy. He contrasts this mindset sharply with his own family's experience as refugees from Lebanon. They chose, he says, personal responsibility, hard work, and merit in their new country, Canada, actively rejecting what he calls wallowing in victimhood.
So in this view, the definition of what counts as offensive or bigoted keeps expanding, sometimes into really strange territory.
That's his claim. He points to the fat acceptance movement, arguing it creates faux victimhood by pushing the healthy at any size idea, sometimes denying links between obesity and health issues, and claiming fat shaming unfairly impacts dating prospects. And he discusses some trans activists who argue it's cissexist or transphobic to have sexual preferences limited only to cisgender people, effectively framing standard heterosexuality or homosexuality as potentially bigoted.
And then there's cultural appropriation. That seems to be a constant source of conflict, he highlights.
Oh, endlessly. He lists example after example of what he sees as manufactured outrage. Katy Perry wearing a geisha outfit, a white teenager wearing a traditional Chinese dress, a kipao, to her prom, and facing massive backlash.
Right, I remember that one.
Controversies over white people having dreadlocks or cornrows. There was that viral video from San Francisco State University. Yoga classes being canceled at universities for being appropriation. Anger over hoop earrings. Someone even claimed thickening of one's eyebrows was appropriating South Asian culture. The list, he suggests, becomes almost absurd.
The Yale Halloween costume incident really seemed like a major flashpoint for this.
Absolutely. Erica Christakis, a lecturer, sent a thoughtful email questioning whether university administrators should be telling students what costumes are acceptable. Just questioning it.
And the reaction.
A complete tsunami of outrage, as he puts it. She ended up resigning. Her husband, Nicholas Christakis, a professor, was famously confronted by students, with one shouting that Yale wasn't about creating an intellectual space, it was about creating a home. The author finds this contrast stark students demanding emotional comfort over intellectual exploration. He satirically compares their struggles over costumes to the sacrifices of soldiers on D-Day. He even made a funny video giving clearance for people to appropriate his Lebanese Jewish culture, and he says the positive, same responses were heartening.
He even mentions a psychological condition related to this desire for victim status, something about self-harm.
Yes, body integrity identity disorder. It's a condition where people feel intensely that a limb doesn't belong to them and may seek amputation, or they desire some other disability. He brings this up as an extreme example of how, in his view, the desire for victim status can become profoundly unhealthy, overriding even basic self-preservation in very rare cases.
What about the idea of finding victimhood even in kindness? That seems completely backwards.
It does sound illogical, but he gives two examples he finds illustrative. One was a study looking for evidence of rape of Palestinian women by Israeli soldiers. It found 0 reported cases. The conclusion drawn by the researcher, however, was that this absence of reported rape actually proved the soldiers were dehumanizing the women so badly they didn't even recognize their own trauma.
That is a very counterintuitive conclusion.
To say the least. Another example. A student at Queen's University wore a hijab for 18 days as an experiment, expecting to face bigotry. Instead, she encountered only kindness. Her conclusion. The kindness must have been overcompensated concealed bigotry.
So damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Pretty much. As the author quips, all roads lead to Islamophobia in that mindset. Yeah. You're bigoted if you're unkind, and you're bigoted if you're kind.
He even draws parallels between these social dynamics and animal mating strategies. That seems like a leap.
It's definitely one of his more provocative analogies. He talks about things like Batesian mimicry in nature, a harmless animal evolving to look like a dangerous one to scare off predators. He jokingly suggests that the brightly colored hair sometimes seen on social justice activists might be a form of this mimicry, signaling ideological fierceness.
Okay, kind of tongue-in-cheek there.
Mostly. But then he brings up Kleptogamy, basically. Deception in mating. Some male animals mimic females to sneak past dominant males and get mating opportunities. He calls it the sneaky fucker strategy.
Right. And how does he connect that to humans, to male social justice warriors?
Okay, so this is where it gets really controversial.
Uh-huh.
He compares some male SJWs to the giant cuttlefish, which can change its appearance to look female on one side while signaling male on the other, deceiving rivals. He posits that some men adopt the language and posture of extreme sensitivity and progressive empathy, donning the accoutrements of a sensitive and non-threatening male, essentially as a sneaky fucker mating strategy, to appeal to certain women or gain social status within those circles.
Wow, that's quite a claim. Does he offer any evidence?
He connects it loosely to research suggesting physically stronger men are statistically less likely to support egalitarian political views, implying that men who aren't physically dominant might adopt other strategies. It's definitely presented as a speculative evolutionary psychology hypothesis, and it's certainly a controversial one.
Moving on to another charged concept, self-flagellating at the altar of progressivism. What's the idea here? Is it like a psychological guilt complex?
He argues that for some people, particularly privileged white Westerners, certain progressive stances function almost like a form of religious atonement, a way to make up for the perceived original sin of being a privileged white Westerner, of not being, say, poor persons of color in the third world.
So progressivism as an alternative religion almost.
That's how he frames it, and this ideological self-flagellation, he contends, leads people to adopt positions that are ultimately harmful to themselves or their society, driven by guilt rather than reason.
What are some examples he gives of this in practice?
He points to Angela Merkel's open border policy in Germany during the 2015 migrant crisis as potential self-flagellation for Germany's historical transgressions. He highlights the irony, from his perspective, that some refugees might hold anti-Semitic views, directly contradicting the supposed atonement for Nazi history. Similarly, he frames debates around U.S. immigration policy partly as self-flagellating recompense for past American foreign policy actions.
And the reparations debate fits into this.
Very clearly, in his view. He notes Democratic candidates in 2020 supporting reparations for slavery, with some even expanding it to other groups. He then highlights what he sees as exploitative examples, these entrepreneurial merchants of victimhood. Like the reparations happy hour in Portland, where white people were asked to pay for drinks for people of color, but not attend because their presence could be triggering. Or Race to Dinner, where white women pay to have dinner with women of color specifically to listen to their pain. Or even a yoga seminar in Seattle focused on undoing whiteness. He finds these absurd and performs a kind of reductio ad absurdum by asking satirically how much he is owed in reparations for his family escaping persecution in Lebanon and ancient Egypt.
Okay, now we're moving into arguably the most sensitive area the book tackles, unpacking the charge of Islamophobia. The author presents this as a clash between truth and sensitivity. What's the core conflict here?
He observes that criticizing Islam often immediately draws accusations of Islamophobia, racism, or bigotry in a way that criticizing other religions like Christianity or Judaism usually doesn't within progressive circles. To counter the idea that any critique is inherently bigoted, he highlights the case of Salim Mansour. Mansour is a practicing Muslim of Indian descent, a political science professor in Canada. Yet he testified before the Canadian Parliament arguing against unrestrained diversity and advocating for limiting immigration from Muslim-majority countries because of what he termed their illiberal values.
So the author uses Mansour to show that criticism can come from within the Muslim community itself.
Exactly. He argues that Mansour's identity and arguments make it very difficult to argue that Mansour is a bigoted, white supremacist Islamophobe. It forces people, he suggests, to engage with the substance of the critique, not just dismiss the critic.
So to analyze the substance, he uses this unique epidemiological perspective, comparing Islam and Judaism as memeplexes. How does that work?
It's about looking at how these sets of ideas, memeplexes, have spread historically. He often starts by asking people to guess the global populations. Most people, he finds, dramatically overestimate the number of Jews worldwide.
What are the actual numbers?
Around 14.5 million Jews globally versus about 1.8 billion Muslims. That's a ratio of roughly 125 Muslims for every Jew, even though Judaism is significantly older. From this purely numerical epidemiological standpoint, he argues the Islamic memeplex has been extraordinarily more successful in spreading.
And he attributes this massive difference in spread to specific features of the religions themselves.
Yes, he points to several key distinctions. Conversion, for instance. Converting to Islam is relatively simple, reciting the Shahada. Converting to Judaism is typically a long, onerous process. More significantly, apostasy, leaving the faith. While historically rare in Judaism, the death penalty for apostasy is still law in several Islamic countries today, and then there's proselytizing. Judaism generally doesn't seek converts, seeing itself as a covenant with a specific people. Islam, he states, has proselytizing as a central religious obligation, historically dividing the world into the House of War, Dar al-Harb, and the House of Islam, Dar al-Islam, with the goal of bringing the former into the latter. He notes there's one Jewish state, Israel, versus 57 member states in the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, OIC.
And he challenges the common narrative about Islam's historical spread, the religion of peace idea.
He directly counters that narrative, often quoting the political scientist Samuel Huntington. Conflict along the fault line between Western and Islamic civilizations has been going on for 1,300 years. And more bluntly, Islam has bloody borders. This perspective emphasizes a history of conflict and conquest in Islam's expansion, which he feels is often overlooked or minimized today.
So moving from history to the present, he then tries to build this nomological network using contemporary data, specifically focusing on Islam and violence. What does he cite from, say, the FBI?
He highlights a really striking statistic from the FBI's most wanted terrorists list. At the time he was writing, 26 out of the 28 individuals on that global list, that's nearly 93%, were linked to Islamic extremist groups. This is despite Muslims making up about 25% of the world's population.
That's a significant overrepresentation.
It is. He also points to ISIS, noting that fighters came from about 80 different countries, but the one thing they all had in common was being Muslim. He then raises a provocative question. Why don't we see converts to Jainism or Buddhism misinterpreting their faiths to become violent terrorists on this scale? He implies there's something specific about how Islam is interpreted by some converts that leads to this outcome.
And it's not just the FBI list. He looks at other official data, too.
Right. He cites U.S. State Department data showing about 81% of designated foreign terrorist organizations are Islamic groups. Canadian government data showed a similar figure, around 80%. He stresses the diversity within these groups, different ethnicities, languages, nationalities, but the common thread is the religious ideology.
What about data on actual terror attacks?
He references the website Religion of Peace, which tracks attacks. They documented over 35,000 Islamist terror attacks globally between 9/11 and the time of his writing. And he cites data from the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism indicating that in 2017, a staggering 96.6% of people murdered by organized terror groups worldwide were killed by Islamic groups. For him, all these data points converge to form a powerful, data-driven picture.
Beyond violence, how do global attitude surveys fit into his network of evidence? What do they show about views toward other groups?
He uses data from sources like the Pew Research Center. On attitudes towards Jews, for example, Pew found extremely high rates of unfavorable views in many Muslim-majority countries, like 98% in Lebanon, 97% in Jordan, 95% in Egypt. He also cites Anti-Defamation League data, identifying 16 of the world's 20 most anti-Semitic countries as being Islamic-majority nations.
What about attitudes towards homosexuality?
Similar pattern in the data he presents. Pew surveys consistently show Muslim-majority countries having the highest levels of intolerance towards gays. Senegal, 98%, Jordan, 97%, Egypt, 95% disapproving. He often contrasts this with attitudes in Israel. And regarding atheism, he notes that all 13 countries worldwide that impose the death penalty for being an atheist are Muslim-majority nations. Plus, Pew data indicated 75% of the world's worst countries for government restrictions on religion were Muslim-majority. He argues this data paints a consistent picture of intolerance embedded in many of these societies.
Okay, so that's a lot of data presented. When people are confronted with this sort of information, what are the common ways they try to deflect or dismiss it, according to the author?
He identifies several common tactics. One he calls the holy 3M of apologia, arguing that any problematic Islamic doctrines are simply mistranslated, misinterpreted, and misunderstood.
Right, the it's taken out of context argument.
Exactly. Then there's the not all Muslims argument, or what he calls the unicorn Islam fallacy. This involves using anecdotes about kind, peaceful Muslim individuals to imply that true Islam must be inherently feminist, pro-gay, pro-Jewish, etc., despite contradictory doctrines or the empirical data he presents. The all religions have extremists argument. He says this ignores the crucial factor of scale. Comparing, say, the extremely rare instance of Jain extremists to the global scale and impact of Islamic extremism is misleading in his view.
And cultural relativism, how does that play a role?
He argues cultural relativism is often used to shut down criticism of practices like FGM, child marriage, or honor killings occurring in some Muslim communities. Criticizing these practices gets framed as racist or bigoted cultural imperialism. He recalls Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau once saying he found the term barbaric used to describe these practices more offensive than the practices themselves. He also tells a story about a progressive female scientist getting angry at him just for sharing a video clip of an Iraqi astronomer arguing the Earth is flat based on Islamic texts. Her reaction wasn't about the content, but that we should be nicer to Muslims. For the author, this shows a disturbing willingness to sacrifice truth for political correctness. This leads to what commentator Stefan Collini called a two-tier society intellectually, where some groups are condescendingly shielded from the critical scrutiny applied to others, a moral asymmetry. He then points to specific elements of Sharia law he finds incompatible with Western values. Physical punishments like amputation or stoning, the reduced legal status of women's testimony, the incredibly high burden of proof for rape victims requiring 4 male witnesses, and the different amounts of blood money paid for killing a Muslim man versus a woman or non-Muslim.
And the final deflection tactic he addresses is the profiling is racist argument.
Yes. He argues that rejecting all forms of profiling, even when based on statistical probabilities, is irrational part of this ostrich parasitic syndrome. He shares his own experiences being profiled at borders due to his birthplace, Lebanon, and considers it rational. He even quotes Jesse Jackson admitting to feeling relieved seeing a white person behind him on a dark street, suggesting profiling based on perceived risk is a basic human cognitive function.
So ignoring probabilities is the problem.
He calls it the cult of indiscriminateness. Rejecting rational distinctions leads to absurdities, like his example of airport security randomly selecting his toddler for screening while ignoring, say, a group of young men from high-risk countries. To discriminate, in the sense of making distinctions based on evidence and probability, he argues, is fundamental to rational thought.
After laying out all these perceived threats to reason, the author does offer a way forward. It starts with understanding how we actually establish truth. What's his main point there?
His fundamental argument is that truth isn't just a matter of opinion. It's established through the scientific method and by building what he consistently refers to as nomological networks of cumulative evidence.
Nomological networks. Can you break that down?
Think of it like building a legal case, but with scientific evidence. You gather multiple independent lines of evidence from different fields or sources, and you see if they all point towards the same conclusion. His prime example is Darwin's On the Origin of Species.
How so?
Darwin didn't just have one piece of evidence. He spent decades collecting evidence from biogeography, geology, embryology, paleontology, animal breeding, all these different areas. Each piece might have been suggestive on its own, but when woven together, they created this incredibly strong, almost airtight network supporting evolution by natural selection. It's like assembling a jigsaw puzzle. The full picture emerges from all the pieces fitting together. That rigorous, evidence-based approach, he argues, is how we determine what's objectively true.
So it's about convergence of evidence from multiple angles.
Yeah.
He provides a couple of key examples himself, right? The first one being about sex differences in toy preferences.
Yes, exactly. He uses this to directly challenge purely social constructivist views of gender. He builds a network of evidence. First, studies on infants show sex-specific preferences for certain types of toys before kids have had much social conditioning. This suggests an innate component.
Okay.
Then there's biology. The digit ratio, the relative length of index and ring fingers, which is linked to prenatal hormone exposure and correlates with things like risk-taking later in life.
Interesting.
He points to a Swedish study where, despite intense efforts in preschools to promote gender neutrality, kids still showed strong preferences for traditionally sex-type toys. Social engineering didn't erase the underlying preferences. Cross-cultural and historical data. An anthropologist's work on dolls across North African cultures, evidence from ancient Greek burial sites showing similar toy patterns. It all points the same way across time and place. And finally, meta-analyses combining results from many studies confirm these robust sex differences in preferences. It's this tsunami of evidence, as he calls it, that forms the network.
And the second big example network he builds is around sex differences in human mating, also using an evolutionary perspective.
Right, another area where he argues biology plays a significant role, challenging purely sociocultural explanations. He starts at the obvious. Sexual dimorphism, average physical differences in size and strength between men and women. He dismisses the "but Katie Holmes is taller than Tom Cruise" type of argument by focusing on population averages.
Makes sense.
Then he dives into psychological differences backed by research. Studies on sexual fantasies consistently show men fantasize more often, about more partners, and with more visual explicitness. Instruments like the Sociosexual Orientation Inventory, SOI, confirm across cultures that men, on average, desire more sexual variety and are more open to casual sex.
What about historical or cross-cultural evidence?
He points to the historical prevalence of polygyny, one man having multiple wives. It's been permitted or preferred in about 85% of documented human cultures throughout history. For him, this anthropological data strongly supports an evolutionary explanation for differing male and female mating strategies. Again, it's about pulling together evidence from biology, psychology, anthropology, history, building that converging network.
This all builds towards a call to action, doesn't it? About individual responsibility in this battle of ideas. He quotes Niemöller and Martin Luther King Jr. about the danger of silence.
Yes, strongly. He argues silence is betrayal when fundamental principles like reason and truth are under attack. He warns against apathy, against the diffusion of responsibility, thinking someone else will speak up. He fears this slow and inexorable death of the West by 1,000 cuts if good people stay silent.
So what does he urge people to actually do?
He gets quite specific. He tells listeners to activate your sense of personal responsibility. Don't subcontract your voice to others. Don't self-censor out of fear. Practically, he suggests, students should challenge professors, politely but firmly. Alumni should consider withdrawing donations from universities that suppress free speech. On social media, engage with opposing views. Don't just retreat into echo chambers. Speak your mind in public discourse. And politically, vote out politicians who undermine these principles. He even points to Trump's 2016 election as, in part, a manifestation of a silent electoral majority pushing back against political correctness.
He also says people shouldn't be afraid to judge others or give offense. That's a really countercultural message today.
It is. He argues that true friendships should be strong enough to handle disagreements about important ideas. He references Buckle's idea that intelligent minds discuss ideas, not just people or things. And he pushes back against the common idea that judging is always wrong, saying the religious prohibition is against hypocrisy, not against making rational assessments or moral distinctions.
He uses a Sam Harris anecdote here.
Yeah, about someone who was fine with religious extremism, like child eye removal or forced burqas, but got incredibly concerned about protecting a terrorist's neuronal freedom. He calls that the epitome of moral cowardice. His point is that making judgments discriminating between good and bad ideas, safe, unsafe situations, is essential to being a functioning adult. To judge is to be human.
And the final piece of advice is to be a honey badger, uncompromising for truth. What's that about?
He uses the honey badger as a metaphor for being fierce and fearless in defending truth and integrity. He connects it to costly signaling in biology. Like a peacock's tail being costly to produce shows its fitness. Speaking truth in a hostile environment is a costly signal of one's commitment.
He acknowledges it is costly for him personally.
Oh, yes. He talks about death threats, lost professional opportunities, being ostracized, even with tenure. He says tenure isn't a magic shield, but he made a conscious choice to go all in. He shares a story of a complaint made to his university over a tweet and how his firm, unapologetic response asserting his free speech rights got the case closed quickly.
So the message is, don't back down when you're standing on principle.
Exactly. Don't let accusations silence you. He reiterates, Criticizing Islam doesn't automatically make you an Islamophobe. Questioning radical feminism isn't misogyny. Debating open borders isn't racism. Discussing fairness in women's sports regarding trans athletes isn't transphobia. He talks about competing rights, like a child's right to privacy in a bathroom versus a trans person's right to access that space. These are complex issues that need discussion, not just shutting down debate with labels. Those labels, he says, are locked and loaded threats meant to intimidate. You need to be sure of your principles and defend them like that honey badger. He praises Gibson's Bakery for fighting Oberlin College over false racism claims and winning an example of not caving to ideological bullies.
So ultimately, what are the stakes here? What is this fight really about, according to the author?
He holds up the University of Chicago's strong statement on academic freedom, no trigger warnings, no cancellations, no safe spaces as the ideal, because the stakes, in his view, are incredibly high. These idea pathogens, as he calls them, are an assault on everything foundational to Western progress: science, reason, logic, freedom of thought and speech, individual liberty, human dignity. It's a battle for the soul of Western civilization, as he sees it.
Wow. Okay, that was definitely a deep dive. We really unpacked this provocative argument about ideas acting like viruses, attacking reason and common sense. We explored concepts like ostrich parasitic syndrome, this rejection of reality, and collective Munchausen, this sort of drive towards victimhood status.
And the author's controversial claim that universities have become ground zero with upside-down reward systems leading to self-censorship and a stifling climate.
Right. We looked at how he believes emotions are hijacking reason in politics and public life, creating this culture of offense where feelings often trump facts, leading to scientists and academics being silenced.
And the direct assault on free speech, not just through cancellations, but through economic pressure, hate speech laws, and this pervasive, I believe in free speech, but mentality that fundamentally misunderstands its purpose. Plus, the role of satire as a tool to expose flawed thinking.
Then we got into the really charged territory of identity politics, the tyranny of the minority idea, the constant expansion of cultural appropriation claims, the concept of self-flagellation as a motivator for certain progressive stances.
And we laid out the author's detailed nonological network, challenging the Islamophobia charge, presenting his compilation of data on historical spread, violence, and global attitudes. Again, important to stress, we've been outlining his arguments and evidence as presented in the source material.
Absolutely. And finally, we looked at his proposed path forward, grounding ourselves in how truth is actually established through cumulative scientific evidence and embracing individual responsibility and courage to speak up, even when it's difficult or unpopular. To be that honey badger for truth.
It's a lot to take in, a very challenging perspective on the current state of public discourse and intellectual life.
It really is. In a world that feels increasingly driven by emotion and, yes, manufactured outrage, maybe the biggest takeaway from this deep dive is the power and necessity of sticking to objective truth as best as we can determine it. The question maybe isn't just what you believe, but why you believe it, and if you're willing to defend reason even when it's hard. So maybe something for you to think about. What steps can you take in your own life to stand up for reason and open inquiry?